I always get questions of how much did it cost, what did it take, and how hard was it or whatever. So I'm just gonna do a video of the entire thing, give as much detail as I can off the top of my head. But this is a 2009 F250 with a 6.7 liter Cummins and a ZF6 transmission. Just to save you the time so you don't have to watch this whole video if you don't care, just to get to it, the cost if you don't buy an engine or a transmission or a truck, just the actual swap parts that I use, including the harnesses and like the mount kits and all that stuff, is about $6,500 to $7,000. For me, I bought a running and driving 6.4, took the engine out, took the transmission out, and I sold that stuff for $7 grand. So I'm only in this about $4,000. The engine, I bought a rust-free 6.7 Cummins that needed a transmission. Took the engine out and I sold the truck and the transmission. I actually made money and kept the engine for free. My transmission, the ZF6, the full swap with the floor, and the actual guy gave me a whole cab. Everything was $1,750. Now that I've got it going, I've got a bunch more money wrapped up in, making it look cool, tires and lights and stuff. And, I did push rods and valve springs and head studs and 2G swap and all that stuff. You don't have to do that. But obviously that's going to cost you some extra. But bare bones, if you do it smart, I'm thinking $8,000 to $9,000 to swap this truck. I guess round up to 10 for random runs to the store and buying hoses and crap, or maybe if you break something, call it 10 grand to swap this truck. And if I'm not mistaken, most guys are paying 15 grand to put a new 6.4 or a built 6.4 in these trucks, and it's still going to blow up. So, I think this is definitely the way to go. The easiest part is probably the transmission. So you just get a 6.0 or 6.4 transmission, and you need to get the trans tunnel, that or build your own trans tunnel. But I get the manual trans tunnel, and you just trim it, and then you put it over here, trace it, cut out your 4, weld the manual tunnel in, no big deal. And the hole needs to be moved back 2.5 inches for the Cummins. So what I do is just kind of trace along the existing hole, but then cut out an extra 2.5 inches of sheet metal here. When you take that out, you can flip it and put it right back in, and that moves your hole back 2.5 inches, and you keep your factory like shape in the 4 holes for your boot. As far as sensors and stuff, you don't have to hook anything up. On my last truck I didn't, but on this truck I actually did put a trans temperature sensor in it. I just welded a nut on the PTO cover for the trans temperature, and then you have to splice it into the harness and run some wires to the sensor. And then on the backup switch, your ZF6 will have a backup switch. You just have to tap into the harness and buy a pigtail and run that to the switch, and you can make all that stuff work like factory. Move on to the engine. So stock intercooler, stock AC, stock radiator, all that stuff. You don't have to change any of that. So there's quite a bit going on here. I'm going to try to not forget anything. So this is a 6.7, but it'd be the same if you were doing a 5.9 common rail. It's all the same mounts and stuff. It's so when you're buying parts, it's going to be common rail. They're not going to say 6.7 or 5.9. So I'm running Mike Futch, I believe is how you pronounce his last name. I'm running his motor mounts, his adapter plate here so that you run the Ford alternator and Ford AC. I'm running his adapter plate for the Ford power steering pump. It's his transmission plate and his motor mounts. All that stuff is pretty self-explanatory. It just all goes right together. Running a 2G swap with it flipped up just for fitment. Running the stock intake box because I think cone filters suck, and this is just it looks nice and kind of factory, makes it clean, or the swap look clean. Factory battery trays, factory degas bottle. Put a, whatever you call this thing, pusher intake horn, and the charge pipe. So on this one, stock 6.4 here, because the 6.4 ones are like squeezed, so it fits through here. And then I cut it off right there, like right as it comes through, and then basically ran a straight tube right to my elbow coming off the turbo. This is an S366, and that is the factory elbow off an HX35, just stuck on the S366. So really, really easy pipe here. It was just one straight piece, and then I did hammer it in right there for the AC line to not be so tight in there. And that reminds me, the AC lines, you got to do a lot of bending and forming on the AC lines, but if you're careful, you can bend these to where they're not rubbing anything, and you don't have to like cut them or modify them or anything like that. Just bend them around. And then on this side, your charge pipe. So factory charge pipe on the bottom end, and then it comes up, and I cut it off flat well, it's really hard to show you, but basically I cut it off flat as soon as it gets above the lower fan shroud, and then I used the piece that I cut off the upper on the driver's side and welded it on there, and you know, lucky me, it just somehow went straight into my 3.5 to 3 boot right off the intake. So one weld on this pipe, one weld on this pipe, couldn't have done it any better. So I'm running the stock fuel system and using the 6.4 lift pump and the obviously stock CP3, and I'm running the stock fuel filter on here. Didn't change any of that stuff. So I got my harness from Kevin Knoll, at least I think that's how you pronounce his last name. So you send him a Dodge harness and your 6.4 harness, and he makes them play nice together basically, and he even gives you a little pigtail that goes inside the cab. So I'm running a Dodge fuel pedal, and the Dodge OBD2 and stuff is inside the cab. So he'll just give you a piece that you pass to your cab, and it actually has a plug down there, so it is removable. So you could like pull the engine and not have to take that stuff out of the cab. So that's pretty nice. Of course, you do have to tune the truck just because it's the swap, but also because if you're swapping a truck, you're probably going to make it have aftermarket stuff. So I just had EFI live tuning. That's nothing special. You don't have to have like a special guy to do that. But the guy that did mine just so happens to be like a swap guy. So he did my tuning, and you just basically plug that into the Dodge ECM and tune it just like you would a Dodge truck, and you know, that's it. You're done. Just to clarify on the wiring, it is really close to plug and play, but not fully. So he sends you all the harnesses and all the wire adapters to run the 6.4 sensors, so you can use like your gauges. And I'm going to buy a monitor. I'm going to buy a 6.4 monitor, not a Dodge monitor. And then obviously it's like the whole Dodge harness for your Dodge ECM, so it has all the sensors that it needs. The only thing that I had to do myself was you have to take the fuse box out, and there's a couple wires in there that you have to cut and splice and connect to other things. I'm not exactly sure what all that does. I know one of them is for the forward lift pump, because the Dodge ECM supplies the forward lift pump with signal, because if you don't, there's some sort of problem there. The Ford doesn't do it correctly since it was swapped. So you use the Dodge signal to power the forward lift pump. And then there was something else in there that I grounded, or that he has you ground no matter what. And then I went ahead and grounded an extra wire that is somewhere in this loom. A lot of guys will tie in here and then just ground it there, but you know, that's kind of crappy. So you actually ground it in the fuse box, and that will allow you to start the truck without pressing the clutch pedal, because then the truck thinks it's in neutral or park all the time, you know. So you don't have to like get in there and press the clutch pedal or any of that crap. You can just fire it up. Almost forgot, radiator hoses. So the lower radiator hose, I'm running the factory 6.4. They have the clip style. 6.4s have this clip style. So I have the factory 6.4 like bottom section down here. Kind of hard to see down in there. And then I have an adapter that goes from 2 to 1.75 inches, and it's really short. If you can see it down in there, it's just a little piece like that. There you go. And you can see the other one coming off of it. That is a 1 inch. So basically it's like this but shorter, and then I have a 1 inch tube teed in so that I could tie the degas bottle, which is here. This runs all the way across the bottom of the fan shroud, and it ties into that lower radiator hose. That way you don't, some people will put like a radiator cap in here. It's kind of redneck. So now you can actually use the factory degas bottle to fill it up, and the factory degas bottle functions, you know, as it should. And then for the upper, I mean, you can't screw that up. Factory upper hose, cut it here, little adapter there. This is just like exhaust pipe from the parts store, and then boom, right there. This just reminded me, so from the factory, your Dodge has a exhaust pressure sensor right here. So I cut that off because I'm not using it, but I did keep the 6.4 exhaust pressure sensor because, you know, that's a nice thing to monitor. So you just get take your 6.4 line, the factory one, and just bend it all up and put it in the bottom of your manifold, and that's one of them wires right there. Goes down to the exhaust pressure. You don't have to keep like EGTs, exhaust pressure. You don't have to use that stuff. That's like, Kevin can wire your harness however you want, but I opted to have like as much stuff as I wanted because I wanted it to be like pretty legit in factory. So I just try to keep everything possible. That made sense anyway. Exhaust, I don't know if there's anything that you can buy like as a friggin' bolt-in exhaust. I don't think so. Maybe DCS, but I don't like them. So I just made an exhaust. You know, it took me an hour, no big deal. You use the stock 6.4 pipe and just basically put a lot of cuts and bends and different splices and stuff in it, but it fits great, and no complaints there. And then I run a factory 6.4 5-inch, or not factory, but a 5-inch exhaust made for a 6.4, and of course it fits great. You just have to tie it into the up pipe or the down pipe. Power steering, so factory reservoir, and like I said earlier, the factory pump. We're using Mike Fletch's adapter there, and you just have to change your hose here to connect, and then the line coming off of the pump down there, I just cut it off and then cut off your original feed line. And actually I didn't have to add any tube in. If you cut them right, you can kind of bend them and then just compression fitting them together. You don't have to add anything extra, just cut them correctly and they'll go together the way you want. Heater hoses, so one of your factory 6.4 heater hoses comes all the way across the top, and it's like a hard line, comes out right here. So then I used, this is an EGR delete tube off of a, I think both of these are, I think these are both EGR delete tubes off of 6.7s, and I just hooked them together, and well, there you go, they work perfect. And then on this side you've got your other one, comes out right here, so I cut it off and then used a 90 elbow. That's grease you see on there. That keeps them from leaking. First of all, makes them go on easier, but it also keeps them from dripping when it's cold outside, because they tend to do that. So put a little bit of grease on there and then cram them down. Anyway, that 90's down, just runs underneath, and then you have a fitting down in there on the back of your Mike Fletch adapter plate that's pointing out this way. And he doesn't tell you this, unfortunately, but you cannot screw an elbow onto that once the plate is installed in the engine. I made that mistake, so I actually had to buy like a really tight elbow that was like male into this piece and then female, so that I actually had room to tighten in, and then put a straight barb in the side of it since it was already installed. But no big deal, I got it on there. That's pretty much the main part of it. I'm drawing a blank as far as anything else that you'd have to do custom. It's actually not as bad as you might think. It's just a lot of trial and error and measuring and squeezing and modifying and fitting, but it's really not that bad when you have the Mike Fletch stuff, and the Kevin Knoll stuff saves you so much like effort and time. It just falls right in there, so it's worth every penny, in my opinion anyway. And then the other crap, like all the charge pipes and stuff, that's no big deal. Fire up real quick, just for shits and gigs. So here's the cluster. Everything does work. The e-brake's on right now. That's why I have a parking light on, or a parking brake light on. But the check engine light, you can get rid of it. On my last truck, I had a 2008 that I had 12 valves swapped in. I had no check engine light. You get on HP tuners and you can go into basically the trouble codes and literally just disable all of them, where it cannot throw a code no matter what. Now I tried that last night, and as you can see, obviously I missed one or two, because here it is. But I'm going to get back in there and get rid of them codes, and then I'll have no lights on the dash. And yeah, people always ask, does the cluster work, and do you have lights and stuff? Well, yeah, the cluster works perfect. It works like a factory truck. The only thing that doesn't work right is your fuel mileage, of course, because it doesn't really know what's going on. See, and all that, of course you don't have to modify any of that, so it does work just like factory. And for me, when I swapped it, I didn't even get rid of the Freon, or not Freon, whatever it is, whatever's in there, the refrigerant. I didn't even take it out. So I unbolted the AC compressor, just let it hang there in the engine bay, took the 6.4 out, put the 6.7 in, and then bolted the AC compressor right back on. And I never took the condenser, or whatever it is, the thing on the front, I never took it out. I just moved it to the side. So yeah, you don't even have to drain your AC. You can just freaking slam the engines in and out and keep the AC going. As you could see earlier, my boot is totally clapped, and I have a new one right here. Just haven't put it in yet because, let me show you here, put on the clutch. When you go into, I call it third, but they call it second, you can see it hit there. And it just barely hits, because when you're actually driving, it's not touching. It's just whenever you actually put it in that it hits. So what I'm going to do is, when I change this boot, which is kind of a pain in the butt, when I change the boot, I am going to take off the shifter and heat it right where it bolts on, and just bend it forward, you know, ever so slightly, that way that, you know, it totally looks stock, like it doesn't look like I changed it, but it won't hit this whenever I put it in gear. And this part down here on the automatic truck, you have a cup holder here that would of course be in the way, so you just got to buy a new one of these that's made for a manual truck. You do have to change the drive shaft, so you have a 2-piece drive shaft on these trucks, so you take out the front section that has a carry bearing on it, take it and have it shortened 3 inches, or you can do it yourself. On my last one I did it myself and it didn't shake, but on this one I was being lazy, so I had a local guy do it for 65 bucks. You know, you can't beat that. That's worth my time. And then the front, somehow, maybe I'm tripping, but on my last truck I shortened the rear 3 and I lengthened the front 3, and somehow the front was like tight. So when I do this one, I'm gonna lengthen the front 2.5. So that's it, pretty much. That's how you come and swap a 6.7